Thank you everyone for being here for our first evening program of 2015. Tonight, our program is The Road to Global Prosperity with Dr. Michael Mandelbaum in conversation with Alan Crane, who doesn't really need any introduction because I'm sure most of you have seen him here. I'll hand it over to Mr. Crane and we'll get started for the night.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I know you're in, and those of you who have been here before, when Dr. Mandelbaum's been here, you know you're in for a great treat again. Whenever I read one of Michael's books, it's like a massage of my brain. It's enjoyable, but most enjoyable work you can have. This is Michael's third time here. Michael came in January 2003 the first time, right after you'd written the ideas that conquered the world, peace, democracy, and
free markets.
I always want to say free trade, the 21st century. Still my favorite book of the first decade of the 21st century. And then came back with the case for Goliath. And we did In Conversation then. We started In Conversation 14 years ago, I guess, at the request of David Rockefeller when he wanted to speak, but he wanted to be interviewed. And so I started this program series at the request of the board at that time. And the second program was with former Secretary Bob Rubin. And the third program was with Michael. And he is, we've had other people, Jeffrey Toobin from the New Yorker, CNN, most recently Peter Baker from the New York Times, and Jim Wolfenson and others. But I mention all that, and there's 10 more people or so, because Michael is, we are recording this? Well, I have to be careful. Michael is the only one we've invited back. Let me just say that. So thank you for accepting our second invitation and being here with us tonight. Michael is, as you know from reading the materials, or if you were here before, the Christian Herder Professor at Johns Hopkins, Paul Nitsky's School of Advanced International Studies, the SICE School at Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C. He's previously studied at Yale, at
well, I took a couple of years in England at King's
College at Cambridge, and has his PhD from Harvard University. I was going to confuse it with where you've taught. He's taught at many other schools in addition, the U.S. Naval Academy, Pennsylvania University in Philadelphia, Columbia University in New York, and is home of his PhD at Harvard University. He's the author of more than 14 books, innumerable articles, many op-eds, which I've enjoyed over the years a great deal. He's edited a number of books. I would say I've read every book. I know I've read every book that he's written in this century. And and the one that would, and I give them as gifts. I've given many of them of gifts. Maybe some of you here have received them. But the people who, and this would be a whole other program, but the most gifts I've given of Michael's books, or the most of his books I've given, have been the meaning of sports. And it might not be clear how that's international affairs, but that's a whole other program. We're going to talk about that later. Because it isn't, it's about sports, and it's one of my favorite books. Michael's also on the board of advisors of the Washington Institute of Near East Policy in D.C. He's been named by Foreign Policy magazine one of the 100 global leaders in international affairs, and he is one of the foremost authorities on international affairs in the world, so it's a great honor to have him with us. I could go on for quite a while, but I won't about him. You'd rather hear from him, but please join me in welcoming Michael tonight.
Thank you.
So, Michael, your new book, and I know you're willing to talk to us about it, or at least you said you would, so I hope we'll stick with that, The Road to Global Prosperity. Your first, 7 books, I'd say, you could tell me more, were about war and peace, Gorbachev and Reagan, nuclear weapons, military activities, a little bit of a different focus than The Road to Global Prosperity. So why The Road to Global Prosperity, and why now? Why are you talking about that now and studying it?
Well, it's a very good question, and let me say before I answer it that I'm honored to be here once again and to be conversing with you, Alan. I'm pleased to be back in Houston, and since this is being recorded, I will say to you what I was saying to Alan before we came up on stage. I've had the privilege of speaking at many World Affairs Councils around the country, and Houston is the best. So congratulations to you. Why did I write this book? Well, It's true that I wrote a number of books about security issues, about geopolitical rivalry, and in fact, my first 3 books were about nuclear weapons, which my wife said should be called either the Hiroshima Trilogy or the Nuclear Family. So I started my career during the Cold War, and the Soviet-American conflict was the presiding spirit and gravitational force and central issue of the Cold War. And then the Cold War ended. And I asked myself, what has taken its place? What is international politics centrally about now? And the conclusion to which I came is that the replacement for the Cold War as the focal point and the gravitational field for relations between and among sovereign countries has become the global economy. So I got interested in the global economy. I decided to write a book about it, and the result is The Road to Global Prosperity, which is about the global economy and its future. I asked myself, where is it going? What is likely to happen? What are the major features of the global economy, and what can be said with a fair degree of certainty about them? I started writing this book before 2008, and it was a relatively optimistic book. And then came 2008, September 15th, the great near meltdown of the American financial system and the deep recession in the United States and in other countries, from which in some ways we haven't still fully recovered. So I had to go back to the drawing board, and I produced another draft, and then came the Euro crisis beginning in 2010. So I had to rewrite that part of the book, but I found, somewhat to my surprise, and certainly to the astonishment of my publisher, that despite these 3 iterations, punctuated by the 2 greatest financial crises since the Great Depression, the 2 greatest financial crises in 75 years, I still turned out to be rather bullish on the future of the global economy. And of course, there's something fitting about that and about the history of the book, because now I'm speaking at Houston at a time when the oil price has taken a plunge. So I seem to be trailing along in the wake of economic disasters with the message, everything's going to be okay, despite the way it looks now. And that is, in general, my view. And the principal chapters of The Road to Global Prosperity are devoted to what I take to be the 4 major issues going forward in the global economy, the 4 major, what I call fault lines that will affect all of us.
Michael, I apologize, but let me interrupt you because I want to ask the people in the back a question. You're going to find this surprising while you put your headphone back on. So I wanted to ask them if they could hear. Could you still hear him? Okay. So we now know you can do anything you want with that thing, and they can still hear you. So you're safe.
Or more likely, it can do anything it wants with me, because that's what happened. I apologize for that.
I didn't want. I know you were at the beginning of the floor.
I've written about the 4 crucial issues that will affect the global economy and therefore will affect all of us. And although there are major challenges for each, there's going to be major activity along each of the 4 fault lines, I still conclude that the future of the global economy and of globalization, the ongoing integration of national economies, is relatively bright, which means that we can look forward to a pretty good, although not perhaps great, economic future.
Now, when we were talking before we got up, you may have noticed when I asked him that question, he said, that's a very good question. And before we came up on stage, he said, well, I'm just going to use that usual tool. If you ask me a question I don't really want, I'll say it's a very good question and answer whatever I want. But I actually answered the question I asked, so that's even better. But how about the 4 factors? Why don't you get into the 4? What's different today that makes the global economy worthy of your...
There are 4 fault lines, and they are, first, the political framework which is necessary for the stability that in turn is necessary for any kind of economic activity. And stability via a political framework is necessary for a local economy, a regional economy, a national economy, and also for the global economy. And the greatest threat to stability is war, and there is the possibility, not the certainty, but the possibility of war in economically important regions. And I can go into that later if there is interest in my doing so. The second fault line, I guess my ear isn't big enough. Too late to do anything about that. The second fault line is the inevitable backlash in every country against all three major cross-border flows: the cross-border flow of products, of money, and of people. That is, the backlash against trade, against finance, and against immigration. And the backlash against immigration is particularly strong in some sectors of this part of the country, but it's a factor everywhere. The third fault line has to do with the fragility of free market financial systems, which are prone to crises, as we now know all too well because of 2008. And the fourth fault line has to do with the economic prospects for the major emerging market economies, the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which are important because their potential for growth is far greater than that of any other country, including the United States, and especially including the other rich countries, that is, Western Europe and Japan. So if the global economy as a whole is going to grow, growth has to come especially from those four countries. And although the potential for growth is high, the extent to which these countries realize that potential depends on how they deal with a particular feature of their politics, which I discuss in the last part of, in fact, the last chapter of The Road to Global Prosperity. So those are the four issues, and that's a brief overview not only of the four issues, but of the major challenges that they face.
You know, being an engineer, when I read a portion of your book that you've just spoken to, I wrote myself out a formula, because you mentioned, you went through the points pretty quickly, but the formula was global prosperity equals a function of politics. So was that a correct formula, and why so?
That is the central message of the book, which is that economics depends upon politics. Economics and politics are like that sort of yin and yang symbol from East Asia, which are nestled within each other. They are distinct, and they have their own distinct logic, but they are also mutually interdependent. We know that politics, especially in Western democracies such as ours, depends upon the economy. We know it's the economy stupid because politicians are always telling us that. But it's equally true that that economics depends upon politics, and that's true for two major reasons. One is that an economy can't function in a vacuum. It needs a political framework. It needs the rule of law, because people will not trade unless they are confident that contracts will be enforced. And by one account, that's where law comes from. The idea of property comes from Roman times, as by some accounts does our Western idea of law. So you can't have economic activity without a stable political and legal framework. And incidentally, some of you will be asking yourself, well, since we get that legal framework from the government, and there's no world government, how can we have a world economy? And the answer is that there is a quasi-government that goes some way toward enforcing contracts and providing the stability that the global economy requires, and the name of that quasi-government is the United States. Well, the second way in which politics affects economics is that politicians are always fiddling with the economy. Now, in the best of circumstances, they do it to deal with what economists call market failures. Markets don't work perfectly, they have undesirable side effects, and when they have undesirable side effects, the government has to step in to correct them. And governments around the world have their own ideas about the uses to which output should be directed, and so they get involved in politics. So in those two very general ways, you cannot understand economics at any level, especially at the global level, without looking into the politics. And that presents a lesson for all of us, which is that that is the reason that economics is not an exact science. That's why economics is not engineering. That's why economics is not physics, because it's embedded in politics, and politics involves choices by human beings, and we human beings are, for better and for worse, unpredictable.
You mentioned the BRIC countries, and in your book you note that there's 3 billion of our 7 billion inhabitants on this earth in those countries today, and you just mentioned earlier the importance of them to the future. But on the point you just spoke about, the politics in those 4 countries are very different. So you're optimistic that they'll contribute. Can you give us a little vignette on each of the countries, walk through those?
Sure. Well, I'm cautiously optimistic. I think there is a basis for rational optimism. But because we're dealing with politics, optimism, like pessimism, is not a sure thing. In Brazil, the salient feature of its politics is the traditional Brazilian and Latin American approach to economic management known as populism, which has had some beneficial effects for Brazil in the 20th century and some beneficial political effects, but involves the government directing resources on a large scale to particular firms and industries and to benefits for individuals. And that can lead to inflation, which was Brazil's great problem in the 20th century, which was finally brought under control in the 1990s. And it also has the effect of directing resources away from uses that lead to long-term growth, above all, productive investment. So Brazil's economic future depends on how well the government can keep this populist impulse under control. As for Russia, here the central feature is Russia's energy. Now, energy has been a great boon to Russia. But unlike that other continental-sized energy-producing country, the United States, the Russian government has used its energy riches as a way of avoiding putting in place the institutions and the policies that are necessary for sustained long-term economic growth. That means that when the price of energy, and especially the price of oil, comes down, as it has, Russia gets into trouble, and Russia is now in deep trouble. Russia would actually be better off, I argue. I'm not saying this for Houston, but I do say it for Russia. Russia would be better off if there were a prolonged price dip, because that would force the Russians to do the things that are necessary in order to sustain long-term economic growth. They would have to have enforceable property rights. They would have to have a real financial system rather than this crony capitalist financial system. As long as Russia remains wedded to energy for its prosperity, it's always going to be dependent on the ups and downs of the energy market, and the downs are going to be very painful. For India, the central political issue is its political system. India is a democracy. Now, democracy is not only a good thing for India, it's indispensable. As I point out in the book, without democracy, India couldn't exist, at least not within its present borders. So discarding democracy is not an option for India. But the way Indian democracy functions, or in some ways doesn't function, has served to inhibit the kinds of measures that India needs to fulfill its economic potential. So what India needs is not a different political system, but a democracy that works better where the requirements for economic growth are concerned. And I must say, the election of Mr. Modi is a hopeful sign. It's a hopeful sign partly because he is committed to some of the measures, such as much better infrastructure on a larger scale, that are clearly necessary for India to grow faster. But it's also a hopeful sign because, as I argue in the book, one way to get better economic policies, is to have a demand for them in the Indian public. What is required is a middle class that cares not about getting paid off with one program or another, but rather which cares about good government. And that's been an important force in the politics and economics of the West. Well, in the elections last year, for the first time, there appeared on a large scale so-called floating voters, swing voters in India, who were willing to vote not for the party their grandparents supported, not for the party that was the patron of their particular caste, but for the party they believed would put in place the kinds of economic policies that would help India grow. So I am quite optimistic about India. For China, the relevant feature of its politics that needs to change for China to fulfill its economic potential is also its political system. Now, China is clearly not a democracy. It's an autocracy, and one has to say that the Chinese autocracy, the governing Communist Party, which arrogates all political power to itself, has a very impressive record of economic management over the last 3 decades, 30 years of double-digit annual economic growth, something that's absolutely unprecedented. But I make the case in the last chapter of The Road to Global Prosperity that the economic model that has brought such spectacular results for China has or is running its course. The Chinese are going to have to make some adjustments to sustain high economic growth, and those adjustments, not surprisingly, involve politics, and specifically, they involve transitioning not necessarily to a full-fledged political democracy such as the one we have in the United States or in the United Kingdom, but a more democratic political system, and especially one that permits broader and more secure economic liberty, including property rights. If the Chinese Communist Party draws the line at this kind of democratization, I think it will pay a price in economic growth foregone.
So, Milo, you started with that you're cautiously optimistic that there'll be this growth. And then you just mentioned a few governments that are challenged and challenging, Russia being a good example in terms of how does it change to reach the point where you'd like it to see so that it will support global prosperity. Why are you optimistic? What kind of factors lead you to optimism around political change that would support economic growth?
Well, that's a very good question. You've put your finger on the weakest case, the weakest part of the case. I don't think that Russia will make the changes necessary to fulfill its economic potential with the current Russian regime. I don't think as long as Mr. Putin is president, there's much hope for Russia making the changes that economic prosperity requires. But I also think that a sustained dip in the oil prices, in the oil price, threatens his regime. This is a regime, and this is a political leader who has surfed on a wave of oil. When Mr. Putin came to power in 2000, the price of oil was something like $20 a barrel. During the course of his term in power, it went up close to 150. Russia boomed. He was able to pay pensions, to increase benefits. A government-dependent middle class grew up in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And at the same time, he was able to pay off his cronies who formed his power base. But all that was possible only because of a steadily, in fact, spectacularly rising oil price. Vladimir Putin was the proverbial man playing the bass tuba the day it rained silver dollars. He gets a lot of credit for his economic management in Russia, and he deserves none of it. It's all a case of being the right person at the right time in the right place. Well, now he's the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if this price dip continues, however difficult it is for this city, it's going to be devastating for that regime. And so I hope, I'm not confidently predicting, but I hope that we will see a substantial change in the way Russia is governed such that it will bring to power people who will carry out more sensible economic policies and, just as important, more sensible, more peaceful foreign policies. That's not guaranteed, and it's also possible that if Putin falls, it could be violent, or it's conceivable you could get somebody even worse from our point of view. All that being said, I see some hope for Russia, but to say I'm optimistic, I guess, puts it more strongly than I would wish to say it.
So prior to the 21st century, and further back you go in history, governments tended to be successful, often by war. How do we grow? Well, we take more territory. Today, what are the differences today that you help support why global prosperity can go on? Because war interrupts global prosperity, drives it down. What makes you optimistic for the whole world in that sense?
Well, that's an important point, and I deal with it to some extent in the introduction and then again in Chapter 1 of The Road to Global Prosperity. We live in a time when war doesn't pay. It doesn't pay, not only does it not pay, but people have gotten the idea that it doesn't pay. It doesn't pay for a variety of reasons. First, the Industrial Revolution means that you can get richer integrating yourself into the industrial global economy than you can just capturing land. Before the Industrial Revolution, land was the source of all wealth, and the more land you had, the wealthier you were, and that was an incentive to conquer as much land as you could. Now you can be a country like Singapore or Switzerland and be richer than much larger countries because of your integration into the global economy. So the great change came with the Industrial Revolution. But of course, the Industrial Revolution came in the 19th century, and we have had a few wars since then. A second change that came was that war just became too deadly, too costly. At the extreme, you have nuclear weapons. And it's clear that a nuclear war would be an economic loser.
Tried to jump off your back, actually.
You sure this thing isn't alive? Maybe I should hold my hand here. There is a very good book, well known among political scientists, by my friend John Mueller of Ohio State, published around 1990, called Retreat from Doomsday: The Obsolescence of Modern War, which makes the case that World War II was the last war and would have been even without nuclear weapons, because it was so destructive and so devastating that people just didn't want to go through it. So the power of modern weapons is another reason that war just looks less attractive than it did. And incidentally, Mr. Putin is already finding that Crimea is an economic loser. They're worse off because of Crimea, all apart from the sanctions that have been imposed. Crimea is a white elephant that now Russia has to support. There's a third reason that war has become less attractive than it used to be, and it fits in with the other two, and that is the growth of globalization. People are increasingly engaged in the global economy. They increasingly trade and invest with others, and that means that they have an incentive for peace so that they can continue to trade and invest. China claims that it should control Taiwan, that Taiwan is a part of China, and that's a very powerful claim among the Chinese. But the Chinese have been, if anything, less aggressive in trying to bring Taiwan within the scope of their control over the last 30 years than they were under Mao, even though they've become militarily more powerful, because they now have a huge investment in a Pacific climate in their region so that they can continue trade and investment. You start a war over Taiwan and suddenly investment dries up, and you never know. You may not be able to ship your goods to North America and to Europe. So global integration also serves as a disincentive for war. Now, I should add, many of you may know, and I do touch on this in the book, that the idea that international trade would make war impossible was first articulated in the 1850s. And there was a book written just before World War I by a man named Norman Angell, for which he received the Nobel Peace Prize, claiming that the world was so interdependent that war would never occur. That book came out in 1912. 2 years later, the worst war in human history broke out. And 25 years after that, yet another even worse war took place. So trade and globalization are not a guarantee against war, but they are a disincentive. And when you put them together with the other two factors that I've mentioned, you find a world where the chances that the great powers will engage in war are lower than they have ever been. They're not zero, but they're low.
So going back to the same theme, a government used to derive its legitimacy from an ideology and from strength and power. And I think you make some good points in the book about how that's evolved along the same theme, particularly, well, you've spoken about Russia, but let's talk about the Chinese today. You don't have Mao anymore. It's still a, quote, communist country, but what do the 1.3 billion people or so consider a successful and legitimate government today?
Well, that is an important point, and it's also one of the premises of the road to global prosperity. We now live in an age when the legitimacy, certainly the popularity of a government, does depend upon its capacity to deliver prosperity. It is the economy stupid all around the world. It's the economy stupid for the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And their legitimacy is, in a way, even shakier than that of the governments of democracies, because they don't have democratic legitimacy. Nobody voted for them. Most communist governments, all communist governments in Europe, collapsed by 1989 because they were mired in economic stagnation, among other reasons. The lesson that the communist leaders of China drew from 1989 and from the demonstrations in China, in Beijing, in Tiananmen Square, and in other cities was they better accelerate growth, because if they don't, they're going to have a very discontented, sullen, perhaps even restive population on their hands. That means that delivering economic growth is their first priority, and that, in turn, leads to a more peaceful foreign policy than they would otherwise conduct. It doesn't guarantee peace, but it means that they'll think not only once, not only twice, but 3 times about embarking on any foreign policy that could interrupt the economic flows that generate the prosperity on which their rule depends. And I've already said that, in my view, Mr. Putin's popularity and legitimacy, such as it is, has depended exclusively on the remarkable economic growth that Russia has undergone during his time in power, which is due exclusively to the rise in the oil price. Now, that's not necessarily, the falling of the oil price is not necessarily good news for change in Russia, because as the oil price falls, as the government tightens its belt, as people have things taken away from them, as they feel poorer, the government becomes less popular, and then it looks for a reason to generate popularity. And one of the things that governments tend to do, and this may in fact explain the attack on Crimea, is to start a war and whip up patriotic sentiment. The war in Crimea came as the oil price was peaking. It came on the heels of demonstrations at the end of 2011 and 2012 against Mr. Putin assuming the presidency again. So there is an argument to be made that when a dictator who has remained in power because of economic growth can no longer deliver economic growth, he will look for some foreign enemy to generate patriotic support. And that is one reason that many people, or many specialists in international relations, worry about a likely decline in Chinese growth, because they fear that the Chinese Communist Party, no longer able to rely on robust economic growth to keep itself in power, will turn to a patriotic nationalist appeal, which will inevitably be anti-Western, anti-American, and anti-Japanese. And we know that China not only claims Taiwan as its own, but claims islands in the East and South China Sea and territorial waters all along its coast that are also claimed by other countries. In fact, it has territorial disputes with virtually every country in East Asia, and those territorial disputes have led to quasi-military encounters. There haven't been actual shootings between navies, but there has been aggressive behavior, especially by the Chinese Navy, and there is the fear that if and as the Communist Party can no longer deliver double-digit annual growth, it will be tempted to emphasize, accentuate, and increase this provocative behavior.
You make the point in your book that the BRIC countries, at least some of them, had, and you, I think, related it earlier, different economic models, import substitution or central planning, but they've risen up in good part by adopting a free market. And how does the adoption of a free market in a society change the culture and the politics which drive it?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. It's a very good question. The victory of the free market was one of the main themes of my 2002 book, to which Alan referred, The Ideas That Conquered the World. Something remarkable happened in the last 3 decades of the 20th century. At the end of World War II, there came to be basically 3 models of economic organization. The free market, which itself had 3 different types, the Anglo-American, the Western European, the Japanese, but they were all basically the same political system, the same economic system. Then there was what one might call broadly socialism, with a lot of government intervention, some government ownership, government direction of capital investment. And then there was communism, the complete government control of all economic activities. Well, in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, in different ways, in different places, basically the free market won the contest. Everybody agreed that the free market was, to coin a phrase, the road to global prosperity, and countries that had been committed to the communist form of economic management with total state control, or the socialist form with more extensive state control, India, for example, or many Latin American countries, abandoned those 2 models and embraced in one way or another the free market system because they wanted to get rich. Now, it's not quite so easy to build a working free market system. You need property rights. You need a financial system. You need people that can operate the various institutions, and that takes a generation. Russia tried to make the transition. It still has not made it. It didn't have the human capital. It didn't have the talent. But over the long term, and this is the subject of yet another of my books called Democracy's Good Name, there is, I believe, an affinity between free market economics and political democracy. Once countries have free market economies, they generate experiences and expectations and skills and institutions that, I argue in that book, over the long term tend to push them toward democracy. And so there is hope that as China becomes more and more committed to our form of free markets, and if and as Russia switches from its current Putin-like crony capitalism to a more Western-style free market system, that will push these 2 countries toward political democracy as well. It's not automatic, it's not rapid, but I think that there is a trend in that direction, and you can see it in places such as Latin America, which made the commitment to economic free markets in the 70s, and then experienced a democratic revival in the 80s and 90s.
So my son and your friend Philip, sitting in the front row, graduate at MIT, will be upset if I don't ask. So what role does technology play in your optimism for the success of the global economy?
Technology is crucial, it's especially crucial for us. economic growth, the promise of globalization and the promise of free markets is economic growth. That's why it's popular. Economic growth depends upon two things. It depends on adding workers, and it depends on increasing productivity. It means you have more workers, and the workers you have can make more with the same effort, the same capital than they could before. Productivity is especially important for us, for the most advanced countries. If you are India, your technological base is rather narrow and rather backward. You can go a long way, you can get a lot of growth simply by adopting technology that's already been invented in the West. This is the basis for the phenomenon that economists call convergence. All other things being equal, and because of politics they are never equal, but all other things being equal, poorer countries should grow faster than richer countries because poorer countries can take advantage of the things that made rich countries rich but that they have not incorporated yet. But if you're a rich country, you can't adopt the technology that you've already incorporated. You have to invent new technology. And we are good at that, and that is why we are the country that blazes the trail and then others follow it. And we depend for technological innovation on places like MIT, where you have people at the cutting edge of technology. So of all of the institutions in the United States, for the purpose of economic growth, and not because of its economics department, but because of its engineers, its physicists, its metallurgists, MIT is probably the most important.
So I know Michael wants to hear your questions, so I'm going to bring some of the questions, and while they're coming up, let me ask you to compare a little bit, because you mentioned both China and India in that last question, particularly India. So their economies are different. They've proceeded differently on this growth you just mentioned, the growth up the industrial ladder. So can you give us the major points of difference there?
China's authoritarian, India's democratic. India's democracy has become dysfunctional in part because of one of its central and most attractive features. You can stop things if you're a democracy. Minorities can get their way, and that's happened in India. They have labor laws that are so constricting that they don't have the kinds of industries that they want. They don't have the kind of industrial base they need because they have not in my backyard to a fare thee well. Nobody wants a factory built near something that's sacred to him or her, and everything's sacred in India. Autocracy has been useful for China because the ruling Communist Party has been able to enforce, without any dissent, certain growth-promoting policies, especially the building of infrastructure. They don't have to get Congress to agree on anything. They can build roads, they can build bridges, they can build airports wherever they like. However, they are reaching a stage where they need India's strengths, where they need better laws, where they need more accountable government because there is so much political tumult in China, some of it reported, some of it not, because people don't have avenues to protest and bring the government to account. India needs to be more like China in that it needs more and better infrastructure, and it needs more and better low-skilled industry of the kind that has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China. But India certainly should not and cannot adopt China's authoritarian political system, because it would fly apart if it did. And it's also worth noting that India has become a world leader in information technology because it's free, because it has property rights, and because it has freedom of inquiry. So in the place where India has world-class industries, it's precisely its democracy and its guarantee of liberty that has made this possible.
So Michael, you spoke about the evolution where war doesn't pay and hurts legitimacy of governments. What about what's happening with ISIS or the IS in Iraq and Syria? Are they going to get large enough to impede to take away your optimism?
Well, I wouldn't recommend ignoring them, although I myself am not much in favor of going to war again in Iraq against ISIS. But my answer is that this is a nuisance, not a central threat. It's a nuisance for two reasons. First, because I don't believe that terrorist organizations can become powerful enough to do serious economic damage in the world. The attacks of September 11th were the exception, not the rule. And second, because almost all of this violence takes place in the Middle East, which, unfortunately for the people of the Middle East, and unfortunately for the rest of the world, is really not part of the global economy. It just doesn't matter. It's a gas station, that's all. If it weren't for energy, it would have no economic role whatsoever.
So one of our members would like to know about something you speak to in wonderful detail and very clearly, as all your writing is, currencies. And the dollar has been, since Bretton Woods, the reserve currency, served a lot of purposes. Is that going to change? What's going to replace it? What do you see in that area?
Well, I do go into that in some detail in The Road to Global Prosperity. Let me talk briefly about the dollar and then about the euro. First of all, the dollar is still the main reserve currency in the world, and that's not going to change. There's a lot of unhappiness with the dollar for good reason, although I should point out that the rest of the world is unhappy with the dollar no matter what happens. When the Fed announced that it was considering quantitative easing, when the Fed engaged in quantitative easing, that is printing dollars to help recover from the recession, the rest of the world complained that we were just driving down our currency, spreading inflation. How could we do this? And then when the Fed hinted that it was considering ending quantitative easing, which would lead interest rates to increase and strengthen the dollar, the same people complained. You got a strong dollar, you're sucking resources out of our economy, as indeed happened. So we can't win. The reason that the dollar is going to continue its role as the world's reserve, which incidentally is not an unalloyed asset for the United States, but that's a more complicated issue. The reason is that there's no plausible substitute. The euro is certainly not a plausible substitute, and the Chinese currency is not a plausible substitute unless and until the Chinese make the kinds of reforms that I've mentioned, because nobody wants to hold his or her assets in a currency that you can't convert freely and whose value is subject to the whim of the Communist Party of China, over which you have no control and which is completely non-transparent. So although there are lots of good reasons to be unhappy with the role of the dollar is now, to paraphrase Churchill on democracy, the worst global currency except for all the others. The euro is, I think, in serious trouble. The first crisis passed when the European Central Bank said that it would buy the bonds of southern European countries without limits, and that calmed the bond markets. The Italians, the Portuguese were able to sell their bonds to finance their deficits at less than prohibitive interest rates. But as the condition for being bailed out, for being helped, they have had to submit to economic policies that have brought austerity. All of Southern Europe is in deep recession with no prospect of emerging from it, and the policies have been insisted on by their creditors, especially the Germans, for good reasons and bad reasons as well. Well, this is all very well if you live in Northern Europe, but in Southern Europe, this austerity is becoming politically untenable. There looks to be a revolt in Greece in about 10 days. There's going to be an election, and a party which has said that it will not abide by these terms is favored to win, or at least to help form the government. If that happens, there's going to be a showdown, basically, between a new Greek government and Germany, and if the Germans are unyielding, they might well leave the euro, and then we don't know what what would happen. The Europeans now believe that the so-called Grexit, the exit of Greece from the euro, would be bearable. And Greece doesn't have a very important economy. The problem is the so-called demonstration effect, contagion. The people in charge of the European Central Bank and European officials in Brussels now profess that the euro and Europe is safe for a Greek exit. But of course, that's what our Federal Reserve believed about letting Lehman Brothers fail in 2008. So I think the euro is in serious trouble. And if I had to predict, if I had to single out one challenge to the global economy that has the greatest chance of doing serious economic damage, and not just to the Europeans, but to us over the next 24 to 36 months, it wouldn't be Chinese belligerence, it wouldn't be Putin remaining in office, it would be the collapse of the euro.
Now, you all have noticed, we couldn't help but notice, and we apologize, we've tried these new headphones tonight, and we did give him a live one in more ways than one. But I know he could handle anything like that. A number of years ago, hopefully some of you saw this also, he was interviewed by Jon Stewart about one of his books. And I know I can't be as funny, but it's probably more hospitable here. That was quite a challenge, and you handled it very well. So you can handle anything. A SAIS alum from 2000, Carolyn Allison, who will make her raise her hand and admit she's here, but I'll paraphrase a little bit. If Putin were to call her tonight, what advice, and I'm sure there's different kinds of advice, should she give to him as to what he should do so Russia is not incredibly vulnerable to oil for their economy?
Well, these are changes that have to be made over the next 5 to 10 years. I don't think that there's anything that Putin can or will do to make these changes. He's too locked in to this system. He's not likely to ask for my advice, but if he did, here's the advice I would give him. Make the same deal that Yeltsin made when he left office. Make a deal with the next regime that you can keep some of your ill-gotten gains, take them and go somewhere else, have nothing to do with the Russian government, spend your time gambling or whatever you want to do, but just go. I should also say, I did appear on The Daily Show, and in answer to that got more attention than anything else I've ever done, including from my students. And anybody who's ever seen that YouTube video always has the same question, which I will answer for you without having asked it. The question always is, what's Jon Stewart really like? And the answer is, like most men in that position, he's shorter than you think.
In your book, we have a question here that I think deals very much with something you address in your book, which is quite fascinating. I won't ask you to go into that, but how we've gotten the disparities in income, which are a big issue in the United States, and many of the factors you go through. So, but let me ask the question that's been asked by one of our members. Would the gap between rich and poor countries create challenges to continuing global prosperity?
Actually, the gap between rich and poor countries has narrowed. The poor countries have been the great beneficiaries of globalization. There are hundreds of millions fewer poor people than there used to be as a result of globalization, and most of them live in China and India. So for poor countries, this has been a great boon. The gap between the rich and the poor has widened within countries. It's widened to some extent in the poor countries because the nature of economic growth is to promote inequality over the short term. I think it's the Kuznets curve that demonstrates this. I guess a Harvard, not an MIT economist, who showed that when rapid economic growth begins, inequality expands, but then it narrows after a while. So, and that is likely China and India's fate. But inequality has increased in the rich countries and in the United States to the point that it is becoming a serious social problem. And that has to do with two things. First of all, it's often blamed on China trade, and that's not really principally responsible for it. But globalization does have a role here. It means that many of the jobs that used to be done in the rich countries are now done in the poor countries. And now it's not just manufacturing jobs, it's white-collar jobs because service jobs can be outsourced because of the digital revolution. So the middle of the economy has been hollowed out, and we have what economists call job skills polarization. If you have very high skills, like most people in this room, you can do very well. If you have no skills, like somebody who comes across the border from Mexico, you can get a job as a gardener or working in a restaurant. And although that's not a high-wage job by American standards, it's a very good job compared to where you came from. In where I live, in suburban Washington, we have lots of immigrants from Central America. And they work very hard. They do low-wage jobs, which are some huge multiple of what they could earn at home. But if you're in the middle, that's a problem. And the other thing that is a problem is the march of technology, especially digitization. When most people here began their working lives, if you were a professional, you probably had somebody working for you answering the phone. There's nobody answering the phone anymore. There are no secretarial jobs. If you remember a movie with Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine from 1960 called The Apartment, Jack Lemmon works for a huge, I think it's an insurance company in downtown New York, and there are 10,000 people all in little cubicles working in that firm. Those jobs are all gone. Those have all been, a few of them have been outsourced to India, but mostly they've been done away with by technology. So we have a serious problem in this country with jobs, and I'm happy to say that I've written a book about that, which was the book before this one, co-authored with my friend Tom Friedman of the New York Times, called That Used to Be Us, how America fell behind in the world we invented and how we can come back. And I think Tom spoke about it here.
Yes.
So that is a serious problem, and it's one of the byproducts of globalization. We as a country have done better because of globalization. We are richer, and even poor people are richer because now they can go to Walmart and buy Chinese-made products far more cheaply than they could buy them if they were made in the United States. Nonetheless, among a large segment of Americans, globalization does produce hardship, and we have not yet figured out a way to cope with that.
So I know you have an appointment, so we have many more questions. I can see there's still more in people's hands, but we'll take just one or two here. So in your book, you mentioned the coining of the phrase BRICS or BRIC by someone at Goldman Sachs, whose name I forget, but here it's said to be Jim O'Neill, 15 years ago.
Yes.
So I applaud our unidentified member who remembered that, but I just wanted to claim I did not remember it. He now claims we should take cognizance of the mint countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I think those are important. And in fact, the BRICS, it's now the BRICS with the S being South Africa, and my friends at the Peterson Institute for International Economics in Washington have made it BRIC, B-R-I-C-K, and put Korea in there. The reason that I stuck with the original formulation was otherwise the chapter would have been too long.
So we have, in Houston, because of our relationship being the energy headquarters of the world, many of our friends from north of the border, and they'd like to know, how does Canada fit in the growth of the world economy? What's its importance to future global prosperity?
Well, Canada is a rich country and will continue to be a rich country and a very well-governed country. Canada was, of all the Western countries, the one that did best out of the financial crisis because the Canadian banks are governed in such a way that they didn't have one. For Canada, natural resources are extremely important. They're not quite as important as they are for Australia. And whereas Australia sells its resources to China, Canada sells its resources to us. And we are probably, all things considered, a better customer than China. So I think that the Canadian outlook is pretty good.
So just two more quick questions. One is about both, maybe that's the end, I don't know. But about both China and India, the bureaucracy in India, which I think you spoke to before as being an inhibitor, and corruption in India, and corruption in China. How do you see those playing in terms of global prosperity, and what can those countries overcome that to continue to contribute to the world economy, or are those high risks around corruption?
Well, corruption, as is obvious from the Chinese case, is not a bar to high economic growth. Corruption is consistent with high economic growth if it's simply regarded as a tax. And that's what it is. So if corruption is predictable, it doesn't create insurmountable difficulties. Other corrupt countries have done well. Indonesia has done well also. Bureaucracy and corruption do present problems for India and China. And incidentally, I'm not saying that corruption is good for an economy. You're much better off with the rule of law. And after a certain point, when you become a more complicated economy, you have to have the rule of law. China has done fine with a relatively simple manufacturing model where they have all of these factories along the coast, which are really assembly plants because the parts come from elsewhere. And people from the hinterlands, from the villages, many of them women, come to work in the factories. They have some minimal education. They're very disciplined. They make much more money than they could farming back home. And they take their money and build a nice home back in their ancestral village. But corruption has not been an inhibitor for China. Corruption is a problem in India as well, a serious problem. But the problem in India is that it's too easy to stop things. You can stop things by bribing people, and you can stop things by passing laws. In China, when bribes are exchanged, that tends to start things. It tends to get things done, and that's better than stopping things. In China, the danger of corruption is that it has led to great political resentment. China is potentially a politically unstable place. There are many, many demonstrations, some of them involving tens of thousands of people every year. And there are two major causes of these demonstrations. One is environmental abuse, and the second is corruption. And they're related because although China has handsome environmental protection laws on the books, they have to be enforced at the regional and local level, and they never are because the polluting industries pay generous bribes to the local officials to turn the other way. So China, as I argue in the book, needs more accountable government as a way of cutting down on this corruption, which is the only way in the long term, I believe, to preserve political stability.
Well, Mike, I want to thank you. We've only touched on a small part of the book. It's a wonderful book. You'll learn. I know you learned a lot already, but if you read it, you'll learn even more. I highly recommend it. As you head out in the back, I think we have books on sale still. All right, because Michael had signed some earlier, and I think those are all signed as well. So, Michael, thank you very much for being here. It's wonderful.
Alan, thank you.